Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, What's New in Forecast Pro TRAC version 7. My name is Sabina Kadar, and I'll be the moderator for today. So we'll begin the webinar shortly, but first, let's go over a few logistics. The webinar is going to run approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. Now, during the webinar, you can submit questions using the control panel on your screen at any time. And we'll be monitoring these questions throughout the webinar, and we'll compile a list for Q&A at the end of the presentation. We'll also be taking questions that are submitted during the Q&A session itself. Now, we'll try to address as many questions as possible, but if we don't get to your question, you'll receive a follow-up email after the conclusion of the webinar. We'll also be taping this webinar, and we'll be emailing you a link to the video sometime next week when it's available. The webinar will also be posted to both the Forecast Pro website as well as the Forecast Pro YouTube channel. And here you can actually find a full archive of past webinars. These are free and they're a great way to catch up on any past webinars that you may have missed. So now I'll turn it over to Sarah Darin to kick off today's webinar, What's New in Forecast Pro TRAC version 7.
Thank you, Sabina. Erik Subatis is here with me today as well, and both of us are really excited to walk you through all this great new functionality in TRAC v7. And given the number of people that were interested in this webinar and all the different places people are from, our sense is that the users are pretty excited about it too. So before we get started, I did want to mention for users who are currently in support, you will be receiving an email to confirm your eligibility this month, and you can expect to get your upgrade next month in August. Now let's get started talking about all this great new functionality. So today we're going to walk you through 4 of the key new functionalities in TRAC v7. Machine learning, forecast value ad reporting, some new Excel collaboration functionality, and product mapping. In addition to these 4 big ones, as you use TRAC v7, you're likely going to find some other new things as well, things like item-specific calculated rows. If you have any questions about the other new things that you encounter as you explore TRAC v7, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. You can email us at any time at support@forecastpro.com, or we're always available to take a phone call as well. So we're going to start off talking about machine learning. Before we demonstrate how machine learning works in Forecast Pro, I just want to give some quick context about how our approach fits in into the whole machine learning and artificial intelligence realm, which at this point has a really pretty large footprint. And essentially, machine learning and AI have emerged as transformational methodologies with lots of different applications, things like facial recognition, medical diagnosing, self-driving cars, the ability of Netflix to know what series you're going to want to watch next, watch tomorrow night. But machine learning isn't just one approach or method. It encompasses a wide range of algorithms and approaches. What these algorithms have in common is that they are designed to find and apply patterns in data. There are basically 2 different types of machine learning that you might encounter. The first is unsupervised machine learning, and the second is supervised machine learning. Unsupervised machine learning uses unlabeled data to find patterns or associations in the data. So it's used for things like speech and facial recognition, market segmentation, things where basically you're trying to group things together which are similar. Supervised machine learning uses labeled data, and it's used to predict outcomes. Since forecasting, demand forecasting in particular, is a type of prediction, that means when we think about where demand forecasting sits within the machine learning world, it's within those supervised machine learning algorithms. algorithms. But there are a lot of supervised machine learning algorithms as well, things like deep neural nets or random forests. There's just a lot to choose from. So when we were thinking about implementing machine learning in Forecast Pro, we first of all had to figure out what type of supervised machine learning algorithm we should use. And we decided to go with something called extreme gradient boosted regression trees. The main reason that we chose to implement this extreme gradient boosting is it has performed very well in forecasting competitions. In particular, in last summer's M5 competition, so that's one of the Macrodocus series competitions, boosting algorithms did very well. And those of you who are not familiar with the Macrodocus competitions, they're basically, one of the most important and acknowledged to be, some of the best forecasting competitions out there. So in terms of what extreme gradient boosted regression trees are, there are two main things here. First of all, it's an ensemble method, meaning it averages results across multiple models. And the type of model that it's averaging across is a regression tree. A regression tree is a type of decision tree that uses logical rules about the inputs to determine a forecast. So that's a very, very high level overview of what we're doing in Forecast Pro. If you want a lot more details about, first of all, how machine learning works in general and how it is specifically implemented in Forecast Pro, we are actually having a webinar on that topic next Thursday, July 22nd, at the same time, 1:30. But it's also, one of the key things that you need to think about is you don't actually have to go to that webinar, because the way that we have actually implemented machine learning in Forecast Pro, we've basically automated it. So we've implemented a fully automated machine learning algorithm that uses just the information in your historic demand. Although if you want to, you don't need to just use the information that's built into your historic demand. You can also include other information, things like events and explanatory variables. So with that, let's actually take a look at how machine learning works in TRAC V7. So I'm going to quickly go over here. Okay, and I'm going to make this a little nicer here. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the bakery data. And those of you who have attended some of our webinars before are probably pretty familiar with this data already. But what we have here is we have cakes and muffins SKUs, and it's organized by customer. When I read this data into TRAC V7, machine learning was actually enabled in expert selection already. And as a reminder to everyone, expert selection is the AI-driven automatic forecasting algorithm that is the workhouse of the program, or the brains of the program. It's how we decide what forecasting model is best for each series. So we've actually now included machine learning in expert selection by default as well. So I'm actually going to go to an item report view here. And again, we're using expert selection for all of the items. And in the item report, you can see what model expert selection is choosing. And as you go through, you can see that we now have machine learning popping up a bit. We keep rolling down. It's popping up a little bit more for muffins than for cakes. We're seeing machine learning come into play or be chosen about 40% of the time. And what I'm actually going to do here now is I'm going to filter to machine learning and add these to the hot list. And we're going to take a look at what some of these machine learning forecasts look like. So starting off here, I'm going to go to the carrot layer cake, and I'm going to scroll down a bit into the forecast report. So you can see in the expert analysis section, we are, for this particular series, considering either exponential smoothing or machine learning, and based on the ability of machine learning to forecast out of sample better, so we have a lower MAD here, we're selecting machine learning. And as we come down here, we have a little bit more in the forecast report. For this particular item, we are using trees that have 2 different levels to them, basically, and that's a concept that we will cover in next week's webinar. And we have 15 trees or 15 models. So the ensemble model that we have has a total of 15 different models in it. And you can also see some of the information that we're getting out of the historic demand and then using to help forecast demand. So we have things like seasonal period is very important here. Interventions, which is kind of like changes in random changes in demand, 1 period lag. So again, all things that are just inherent in the historic demand already. And as we can see going through here, the number of trees for this next item is actually 40. A deeper tree is used. So for each item, we're also trying to find the best machine learning algorithm. And again, by best, we're really defining that as the one that can forecast out of sample most accurately. So one thing that you're going to want to think about, though, as you think about using machine learning as a model, is machine learning does take longer than other forecasting methods. That is because the algorithm is essentially analyzing the data and creating multiple models to include in the ensemble. If longer forecasting times are a concern, you do have the ability to disable machine learning. And to do that, you are going to want to go to the Options tab, Performance, and you're able to select this Exclude Machine Learning. Even if you do exclude machine learning from expert selection, which we don't necessarily recommend, we think it's a great idea to give it the extra time, but if you do, I'm going to go ahead and do that and let that reforecast, you still have the ability to use machine learning. So just like you can apply an exponential smoothing model to an explicitly to a series, you can also explicitly use a machine learning model. So if I go back up to the carrot cakes here, and remember before we had a machine learning model with, I think it was a depth of 2 and 15 trees. If I just click on the machine learning icon here, it is going to apply, select an automatic machine learning model, and you can see that this is the same one that expert selection had come up with. If we go to the drop down here, you can see a few other things that you can select. One of them is expert with ML, and I'm going to go ahead and select that. What expert with ML does is it's basically expert selection with machine learning enabled for that particular item. So it allows you to include machine learning in expert selection on an item by item basis. And that might be useful, again, if you're concerned about performance, but you do want to be using machine learning and expert selection for a subset of your series. Finally, you also have the ability to customize a machine learning model. So I'm going to go to Manage to bring up the customization. And within the customization, you have the ability to include other information that you think is important to your demand. So you can include events, and you can include as many event schedules as you like, and explanatory variables, which we don't have any here, but had we read in any explanatory variables, they would all be listed here. And again, you could choose whichever ones you would like. So I am going to go and already have this model here. I actually go to select both of these event schedules. The first event schedule has just a single event code for promotions, and those are pretty much aligned with the spikes in the data. The second one has one single date in it that has an event called non-event, because it basically is a random thing that I put in there. And I'm going to hit OK here. And you can now see we've changed our modifier here, and we have a new model. We now have 16 trees at different depth because we've optimized the model to the new data. And you can also see we have up here the schedule one, that one of the event schedules, that promotion variable is coming in, and it is a really important variable. I probably actually should have mentioned before, the variables that we have here, the most important ones are listed on the top. They're the ones that have the highest gain. And the gain is basically a measure of how much the variable is contributing to the overall accuracy of the model. So the things on top are the most important variables. The other thing that you might notice here is that schedule 2 doesn't even show up in the model. So one of the things that the machine learning algorithm can do that regression or event models cannot do is it can determine if a variable should be included or not. So in this case, we put a check next to schedule 02. The algorithm was able to learn that that particular event schedule did not help with forecasting at all, and therefore it was not included in the final model. So that is an advantage of machine learning, but again, learning takes a little bit of time. So in terms of performance, you will be seeing that machine learning might slow down some of your series, but we think it's worth it. So that concludes our whirlwind tour of machine learning. And again, if you want more details about it, please do join our webinar next week to learn more and possibly clarify any of the confusion that I might have created. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Erik Subatis to talk about forecast value add reports.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So we're going to jump back over to the slides here for a second. All right, so I'm going to talk about the next two topics, which are forecast value add, as well as some improvements to the Excel-based collaboration in Forecast Pro. We'll try to move through them reasonably swiftly to leave ample time for the product mapping and Q&A. So we'll start with forecast value add. Forecast value add is effectively a reporting method to help us measure forecast accuracy with a particular emphasis on the inputs to our forecasting process. So most organizations, are going to have sort of a multi-layered forecasting process. Whether it's part of like formal SIOP or IBP, or even if it's just more of a formal process, usually we're generating some sort of baseline forecast. Could be as simple as a moving average or the same as last year, or hopefully you're using a tool like Forecast Pro to come up with the statistical forecast. And then we're often going through a process of review, right? We're taking a look at the forecasts, we're incorporating what we know about our business and adding judgment on top of it. But what can be challenging as we go to start measuring performance is understanding where along the way are we really adding value as we start to make those changes to our forecasts. When we touch it, are we helping ourselves out? If you look into forecast value add, you'll often pretty quickly come across a chart like this. So sort of a stepwise chart looking at forecast value add. So logical to kind of walk through this simple example first before we get more specific into the Forecast Pro implementation of value add. The first column here is the process step. So that basically represents the input to our forecasting process. And it's pretty conventional to start with the naive one. The naive forecast can have varying definitions. Often it's the same value as the previous period, or it might be the same as last year. Could even be like a moving average. The bottom line is, the idea is it's kind of an effortless forecast to use as sort of a baseline measurement for, are we adding value even with a statistical model, for example. But you can see here that we also have a statistical baseline, perhaps generated with a more sophisticated model, and a consensus row where our judgment is incorporated. And next to that, pretty self-explanatory, we have their accuracies. So we can see that the naive, statistical, and consensus judgmental forecasts have accuracies of 75, 85, and 80% respectively here. Now, when you move to the right, you get more into the core of what the value add is. Effectively, this column is comparing the forecasts with the ones preceding them. So this column compares the statistical and the consensus, respectively, to the naive forecast. And we see here that the statistical forecast is a 10% improvement over the naive, and the consensus is a 5% improvement over the naive. And so we see here that both forecasts are an improvement over the simple naive forecast. And then proceeding in stepwise fashion, the last row compares the consensus, bottommost forecast, versus the statistical. How much additional value are we adding or not adding? And in this particular example, you can see that the consensus forecast was actually worse than the statistical. So in short, you can see the idea here is we're trying to understand, when we touch the forecast, we're modeling the data, where are we getting value as we move along? So moving right along, in Forecast Pro, we're going to see that we can kind of take this a step further beyond the very simple example that I just showed you. And I think it's useful to kind of view this through a lens of some things that Forecast Pro already does. So we have a pretty big crowd on the call today, so I'm just going to spend like 2 minutes and very quickly review some key basic functionality to understand why our implementation of FBA can be pretty nifty. First of all, one core functionality of Forecast Pro is our customizable override facility. And so in this screenshot, you can see we have that statistical baseline, but here we have multiple rows for inputs. In general, you can customize this grid as much as you want. You have 10 rows for input to work with, and you can name them anything, right? They don't have to be sales or consensus. But in this case in particular, you can see we have additional inputs besides just the consensus forecast. And secondly, Forecast Pro archives your forecasts over time. So a good illustration of this is this small little waterfall chart example where we are snapshotting the forecast during each rolling period. And critically here, during each of those snapshots, we are taking a picture essentially of the statistical, of the sales, of the consensus, and of the final forecast. So every period we capture all of that information, even if it's shifting in time. So I'm going to move over into Forecast Pro now. You can probably see kind of where I'm going with this, where rather than just comparing like one judgmental adjustment, we can get as sophisticated as we want, depending on how we've customized the tool to suit our business. So first off, the report, of course, is going to be under the Reports tab. So there's an FBA report. We can click it, and it'll pop right up. And here we can see that familiar stepwise view as we saw in the original slide. But here you can see we've added a few rows. First off, we can display the actual. So simple but nifty additions so that we can see how, the number we're comparing against, essentially. We have the naive and the statistical forecast, just like we had in the example. But here, once again, you probably saw where I was going. Instead of just the one row for the input, we have sort of this multiple layers. So we can see how sales added value to the forecast, or lack thereof, and the consensus forecast. So I won't rehash the whole thing for the sake of brevity, but I'll just call attention kind of down to the bottom part here, where we can see that the consensus forecast effectively added value across the board, but the sales forecast was actually worse, not only than the statistical, but also worse than the naive. And so this is the sort of valuable insight that we can gain from these views. Just two other quick things that I'll point out here. Once again, like the sales and consensus rows are customizable. So you could display more or less here, and they're going to be sensitive to the names of the inputs that you've chosen. Furthermore, you can choose which other rows to display. So just as like a very, very quick example, if I wanted to just compare like the statistical forecast to the sales forecast, we could simplify it down so we're just seeing that information, for example. Secondly, and I should say lastly on this topic, it's notable that we also have a global version of this report. So the stepwise view is really an item by item or group by group view. So very useful for digging into a particular item. But of course, many of us are dealing with substantial scale. And so the global reports can be a good way of slicing and dicing larger data using the same or similar metrics. Whether we want to filter or sort based on the hierarchy, the process step, the actual errors and so on, we have access to that here. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, before I jump back into the slides for one sec, the other piece of functionality I'm going to briefly talk about is the Excel collaboration improvements. Once again, I think it helps to have a little bit of recap here. There may be some folks on the call who either are not aware of the Excel collaboration or perhaps haven't used it. As most probably know, however, we offer what are called collaborator licenses for Forecast Pro. And these days, as of version 6, they install an Excel add-in that enables this alternative way to collaborate on your forecasts. And the concept's pretty straightforward. As the forecaster, I can kick out some nice looking functionality-enabled spreadsheets for folks to review, make their changes, and then kick back in. Now, these collaborators don't have to be sales reps, but in our experience, one of the most common use cases goes something like this. I generate a baseline forecast. I want to kick out a bunch of spreadsheets that contain the forecasts that these sales reps are responsible for. They can review them, give me the thumbs up, thumbs down, add their adjustments, which hopefully add value to the forecast for our last discussion, and then I can kick them back in. So that's sort of the high level recap of the Excel collaboration piece. So jumping back to the slides for one second, the first iteration of this Excel collaboration piece was useful, and it had some flexibility. We could do things like export the forecasts at various levels of our hierarchy, for example. There are also multiple templates for how the Excel collaboration sheets work. We've expanded on that, with a particular eye toward giving the collaborators more access to more information and letting them see the forecasts in different ways. So once again, for the sake of brevity, I'm going to really show an example of just one of these, but I want to make you aware of all three. First, a little bit of review. Forecast Pro allows us to work both in different units of measure and in alternative hierarchies. We're now able to export the forecasts for review in Excel in both of these states. So practical example, typically with alternative units, many people are working both in their standard units and in dollars. And if I want to, for example, hand off my forecasts in dollars for sales to review and make their changes in dollars, we can now do that. They can make their changes, we can kick it back in, and the system will convert back to units for us. Secondly, and the one I'm going to show you, is we also have the ability to now export and display the external data in Excel. So external data is a bit of a vague term, so same kind of deal if you haven't worked with it before, just a little bit of background there. You're able to bring in Forecast Pro TRAC, data other than just your historic demand. So common practical examples of this tend to be things like what's already on order going forward, what's on hand. If we have forecasts that were generated externally, say from customers or from finance, we could bring those into Forecast Pro for comparison's sake. If we're tracking against a static budget, I might want to import that. And so now for my collaborators, if I want to kick that information out alongside the forecasts, we can do that. And finally, you can also export some additional fields into these Excel sheets, including what we call custom filters. So let's say they want to see the ABC Pareto codes, classifications for your items. We can now kick those out, and the sheets are much easier to sort as well. So a little bit of rapid fire, like I said, but let's show you a quick example of this as well back in Forecast Pro before I give it back to Sarah. So if we head back to this Excel collaboration box, you'll notice we have this new drop-down menu here. We'll be able to see all the different external data that we brought into the system. And so you can see in this particular example, we have a bunch of externally generated forecasts, as well as a row for open orders. So for example, if I wanted to give my sales reps visibility into what's already on order and say like what the customers are already suggesting, so they can use that while they're making their own changes, we can simply check those and generate the sheets. And so what I'm going to do here is pop open one of the sheets. So this is for Nancy, the sales rep. Some of you may have seen these before, in which case some of this will be familiar. We can see in these white rows, these are all the forecasts that we've exported for Nancy to review. But alongside each item, we can also see the customer forecast and, like I said, what's on order going forward. And so we have all the information right next to each other. Here, for example, if I'm comparing to what the customer said and I want to split the difference, we can use that information and make these adjustments in real time. So in short, quite a bit more flexibility now with these Excel collaboration sheets. And if you wanted to take a look at any of the smaller things I mentioned, just reach out. So last but not least, I'm going to give it back to Sarah to talk about the fourth and final big improvement to Forecast Pro TRAC V7, which is product mapping.
Thank you, Erik. Okay, I'm going to start off going back to the slides. Okay, so first of all, what is product mapping? Product mapping allows you to combine historic data from multiple items into a single forecast history. That forecast history is then what is used to generate the forecast. Product mapping is it's particularly useful for things like new product forecasting. So, for example, if you're replacing a SKU with a new one, you can combine the old SKU demand history with the new history, if it exists, into one forecast history for that new SKU. Doing this will give you a much better forecast than what you would be able to generate with just that new SKU history, assuming that it's a very short history. Product mapping is also going to be very useful for things like if you're opening a new warehouse. By mapping the sales for items in your old warehouse to the same items in the new warehouse, you can, doing that, generate a good demand forecast for your new warehouse. In Forecast Pro, you can create these mappings, and you can do it interactively in Forecast Pro, or we also support the ability to read in product mappings and mapped history from Excel files. And while I'm doing it interactively in Forecast Pro is pretty instructive as to how it works. From an ongoing standpoint, and particularly for people who have a lot of product mappings that they're dealing with on a monthly basis, using those Excel files is going to be really helpful. So before we take a look in the product, we're just going to walk through a quick example of exactly how we're generating these forecast histories. So again, we have an old product, we have demand history, that old product. We have new product, we may have some demand history for that new product as well. This old product, so what we're going to do is we're going to basically sum these two demand histories into the forecast history. And just quickly from a kind of definitional standpoint, the gray here, the old product demand history, is what we refer to as mapped history. So it's the mapped history is what we are mapping into the new product. This is the actual history here. And then when we combine it, we're creating a forecast history. Okay, so let's go back to TRAC again here. And here we go. Okay, so here we are back with our bakery data, although you may note that it's organized a little bit differently now. We have SKU on the third level and customers on the fourth level. You also might notice that we have a few more SKUs added in here. Particularly for butter cakes, we now have 3 SKUs. So we have butter cakes 1, and you can see by the gray icon that it's a discontinued SKU. So we last had sales in about July 2020. And then we have Butter Cakes 2. Butter Cakes 2 launched in July 2020, and it's been on the market being sold in the various customers for about a year now. And with that year of demand history, we're generating a flatline forecast. The reason we have a flatline forecast is there's not enough historic demand to detect a seasonal pattern. Now, this is an item we know is seasonal, and we need our forecast to be seasonal. So having a flatline forecast isn't going to work for us. And then finally, we have this third SKU here, and this is a SKU that we expect to launch in the fall. So October 2021, it is going to be coming online, replacing SKU 2 of Butter Cakes in the quest to continually improve butter cakes in all the customers. And you can see that right now we have a 0 forecast for this SKU, and obviously that's not going to work as well either. We need to have a good forecast for this SKU before it has actually launched. So essentially what I want to do is I want to map the history from this discontinued SKU into SKU 2 and use that combined history to generate a forecast for Butter Cakes SKU 2. And then I want to take that forecast history for Butter Cakes 2 and map it into Butter Cakes 3. So I would then be using that same forecast history to generate a forecast for Butter Cakes SKU 3. So to do that interactively, we're going to go to the forecasting tab here, and we're going to click on the product mapping icon to open up the product mapping dialog box. And a couple of things about this dialog box. On the top, you're going to see an area called Map To. So this is the item that we're generating the forecast history for. And whatever is selected on the navigator is what we're actually selecting for. You can see it's updating as I go through the navigator. I'm actually going to leave it on Food King Butter 2. Below that, we have Map From. So what we're showing here is all of the series in the project. So you can select one or more of the series to map to map to Butter Cakes 2 in Food King. So if I'm just randomly, you can see I can do as many as I want. In reality, I really only want to be selecting Butter Cakes SKU 1 in Food King, and I'm going to move this a little bit. And you'll notice that when we opened up this dialog box, a few things happened to the graph as well. So the graph changed as well. The reason that happened is the product mapping dialog box really is working in conjunction with the graph right now, so that you can visualize what your selections in the dialog box are producing in regards to a forecast history. So you can see in yellow here what our proposed forecast history is at this point. So before you hit create, we just want to give you a chance to visualize what it is. So I'm actually going to go ahead and commit to this. And you can see when I commit, we get this blue line of forecast history introduced. So the forecast history has been created and is now being used for the forecast. So before we take a look at that forecast, let's go ahead and do our second product mapping that we know we want to do. And that one was for SKU 3 here. So I'm going to go and select Butter Cakes 2. And note, again, what we're mapping is the forecast history for Butter Cakes 2, not just that last 12 months, which was the actual history for Butter Cakes. So essentially the forecast history for Butter Cakes 3 is going to be the same as the forecast history for Butter Cakes 2, since there is no actual history for Butter Cakes 3 yet. So I'm going to go ahead and commit on this one as well. And I'm going to hit exit. And you'll notice that when I hit exit, the graph returned almost completely back to what it was before. The one difference is that we have taken the liberty of adding in forecast history into both your graph as well as into your override grid. So again, the idea here is if this is the history that's actually being used to create your forecast, this is the history that you want to be actually viewing on the graph as well. And the other big thing is we now actually have a pretty good looking forecast for Butter Cakes 3. And remember, this is the product that has not even launched yet. So before launch, we're able to generate this forecast. If I go up to Butter Cakes 2 here, you can see we have a very similar forecast. And again, before for Butter Cakes 2, we had a flatline forecast. And now we have a forecast that's reflecting the seasonality. So the one other thing, though, that we're going to want to think about in terms of this transition from 2 to 3 is when is 3 launching and when is SKU 2 actually going off the market, so that transition. One of the things that we can do now is we now also have this start dates icon on the forecasting tab. So I can use that. I'm actually going to go back to Food King 3 first. And, okay. Start dates. I'm going to select start forecast on, and I'm going to say I want to start forecasting this on October 2021. And you can see now that we're actually zeroing out sales until the actual launch. And suppose at that time, that's also when we're discontinuing the SKU 2. I can do that by going here and discontinuing as after September 2021. And now as we transition from 2 to 3, really only one of the products is going to be actually included as a forecast. So another thing that is going to be useful as you're doing these product mappings, particularly interactively, is understanding what forecast history exists and mapped history exists across your entire project. So we have another report in here. If we go to the reports tab, you see a mapping report icon. And if you click this, that will open up your mapping report. And I'm just going to go ahead and close that there and auto arrange. So you can see the mapping report is basically just a history of every product mapping that exists in your project right now. So in this case, we did 2 interactive product mappings, one for Butter Cakes 2 and one for Butter Cakes 3, and they each have a line in here. And in this particular view, we're able to see what the map from item was and the map to, as well as who did it and when it was done. So then we've talked about the interactive files. You're also able to output product mapping files as well as mapped history files that are generated from this product mapping report. So to take a look at that, I'm going to go to the Export tab, and I'm going to click on the product mapping file, and I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I'm going to go and open this now. Of course, I cannot. There we go. I'm going to open it here. So this is what the product mapping file looks like. Really simple, straightforward. You basically, in the first 4 columns, we have the map 2 item, the attributes for the map 2 item, and the next 4 columns are showing us the attributes for the map from column. So for example, if you had a hierarchy with 8 attributes in your project, you would be using the first 8 columns to specify what your map 2 item is, and you'd be using the next 8 columns to specify what the map from product is. There are some other options that you can use in these files. Those are all pretty well documented, but this is the very basics that you need for a product mapping file. So I'm actually going to go back to the program here and show you how to read a product mapping file in. So I'm going to go to the Home tab. We read in the product mapping files using the data manager. So if I open the data manager, you'll see at the bottom here, we've added another row, and it's called mapped history. And what you can do here is you can add in whatever mapped file. And I go here. Instead of choosing the one that we just created, I'm actually going to use a slightly more complicated one with a lot more product mappings in it. And I refresh that. This is very similar to the overrides dialog that you'll see where you're given the ability, I can either get rid of all my existing forecast histories and only use what's in the file, or I can add on top of them. I'm going to go ahead and replace here. So we've read those in. I'm going to hit exit. And now in the product mapping report here, you can see all of the product mappings that I just read in with a click of the button. So really, really easy to do that. In addition to the product mapping files, we also have something called the mapped history file. And this is going to be really useful if the map from item that you want, the item that you want to be mapping from, your old SKU, so to speak, is no longer in your project. If that's the case, what you can do is you can read in the actual values that you want to be mapping to your new product or whatever SKU that you're mapping to. And just to quickly show you what that looks like, we have this product mapping file over here. So the idea here is you have your map 2 item, and you just have the exact values that you want Forecast Pro to use as your mapped history. So your forecast history is going to be the sum of what is in this row plus the actual demand history for your map 2 product. So that, I think, concludes our tour of product mapping, and we've left at least a little bit of time for questions. So are there any questions, Sabina?
Yeah, well, here, I'll read some off. Well, first of all, there's been a lot of questions. So just to reiterate something that Sabina said at the beginning, if we don't get to yours, we'll be in touch pretty shortly. But basically, just going to take them more or less chronologically. So they're going to go roughly in order of the topics we covered. Now, the first question I actually was going to answer quickly. Sarah actually covered this, but there were enough similar questions that it's just worth reviewing very quickly. I'll just read the first one off. With machine learning being part of expert selection, have you noticed any performance changes? And if so, is there an option to disable it? I know Sarah mentioned this already, but I think it's just worth reviewing because a lot of folks asked. Short version, yes, machine learning is more performance intensive. If you're dealing with performance challenges now, you'll want to think about how or whether to include machine learning as part of expert selection. That said, as Sarah just showed on the screen, you can exclude it from expert selection by default. That's a logical thing to do if you're dealing with scale. But what's critical is even if you choose to include it from default expert selection, you still have the option to use it as a model just like any other model. And further to that, you can specifically, even if you're using expert selection for many items, you can choose to sort of add on machine learning to the expert selection for just specific items or subsets of your data. So I know Sarah walked through that, but there were enough questions where it's worth reiterating. So let's swiftly move on to some other questions. So I'll give Sarah all the hard ones. How many sales periods is optimal for machine learning? Would you say it's different than classical methods?
So that is a good question. And bottom line, I don't think it is all that different. So basically, I would say optimally you have 5+ years of data. I know most people don't have that much. So machine learning does work well still with that 2 to to 3 years. Ideally 3 years, really. And the reason and I actually say that for all of expert selection, not just machine learning. And the reason I say that is the way expert selection works is after going through a bunch of heuristic type rules to determine what types of methods should be considered, it often will come at the end of the day do a holdout analysis to determine which of the methods is really forecasting most accurately. And if you have only 2 years of data, when you do your holdout, you're doing a holdout with less than 2 years of data. So actually having 2.5+ years of data means that your holdout analysis is done on at least 2 years of data, which in terms of how well expert selection can do a good job of choosing between the different methods, having that at least 3 years of data is good to have.
It just, is machine learning still applicable if you do have less, short data sets? Could you still technically?
You can technically still use machine learning. The algorithm does actually limit itself to very, very simple models with not a lot of treats. Because again, when you have very little data, it's a lot of things you don't want to end up overfitting the data. So technically it will still work. Within expert selection, we have always had a rule of if you have 5 periods or less, it's going to be a simple moving average. And that still holds. If in expert selection, if you have 5 or less, it is going to choose a simple moving average.
Great. So yeah, so moving on to another quick machine learning question. I'll take this one too, and Sarah, if you have additional comments, do chime in. The question is, and I'm going to rephrase it just slightly, is top-down forecasting compatible with the machine learning methodology? The quick version there is yes, absolutely. The machine learning is a model on a time series, just like any other model. And therefore you can apply it at any level where top-down is involved. So if you want to use machine learning at a high level, forecast top-down from there, that's fine. Without turning this into a tutorial on how our top-down logic works, we blow down based on the statistically forecast values at lower levels. So of course, machine learning could be used down there, which would form the basis of the proportional allocation as well. But once again, the quick version is the machine learning methodology does not really change or impact your ability to use bottom-up or top-down forecasting in Forecast Pro. Another just quick one, this is also kind of pertains to both machine learning and forecast value add, and I'll take this one as well real quick. This is a question just about the flavors of Forecast Pro. The question is, does Forecast Pro 100 have machine learning and forecast value add included? All of our products have more or less all the model approaches. So by extension, machine learning is in all products, including Forecast Pro 100. Forecast value add, however, is an extension of the accuracy tracking, which requires archiving of your forecasts, and therefore is only available in Forecast Pro TRAC.
And quickly to add to that, they did not mention product mapping, but product mapping is also only available in TRAC.
Yep. Okay. So let's see. I'll give this one to you, Sarah. This one's kind of about the Excel collaboration. In the collaboration view, so in the spreadsheet, can conditional formatting of Excel be used? For example, only seeing a difference of a percentage flagged by color, or maybe just a more general, and then maybe I could expand on that too, just what sort of Excel features you take advantage of.
Right. Okay, so I'm actually going to go to the sheet that we have open here. So when you're using it, this orange actually, this is conditional formatting. So the short answer is no, you cannot use conditional formatting within the protected area of the sheet. Outside of this sheet though, so to the right and underneath here, you can actually do whatever you want. You can put in whatever values you want, format it as you want. And you also do have the ability to add in other sheets if you do want to use formatting or copy and paste or anything like that that you might want. You can copy and paste within this region too. But basically just, to make sure that we're keeping the integrity of the results and making sure that we come up with the right values to read back into the project, we have kind of locked down some of the functionality within this kind of protected part of the grid.
This one actually goes back to FBA. I'll answer this one, I believe. The question is, how customizable is the forecast value add analysis? And so this gentleman said, we've made some consensus decisions at a higher level in the hierarchy, so being able to evaluate that at variable levels would be helpful. You can use the forecast value add at any level. I know I just walked through a quick example where I think I was focusing really just at the bottom, which happened to be a skew by customer combination, but you can access those forecast value adds anywhere. Worth noting that in regards to like the individual overrides, the actual like display of the value add will be sensitive to where the override was explicitly made. So a little bit of a mouthful, but based on the question, it sounds like, if you've made some decisions and some adjustments at the higher level, you will see the value add there versus, the statistical forecast or the aggregation thereof at that level, and any other adjustments that you might have made. All right. So sorry, I've got a multitasking here. Let's take one more question because we're coming up on the hour. Oh yeah, so this is actually a good one, and I actually personally don't know the answer to this question, so I'll ask.
Okay, let's hope I do.
So we have, this is a kind of specific example. I think the specific example kind of helps set some context. We have some items that have moved from a certain number of units to another number of units, but the unit of measure is cases. Can the mapping also do like a conversion on the history, for example, like map 1.5 times the history or 50% of the history?
So you can actually map percentages from one item to the next, and I think all I need is the.
I saw that.
Yeah. So when you're doing the mappings, you can say, for example, I want to map only 50% of the demand from butter cakes to, if we had butter cakes 3 here, which we don't, into butter cakes 3. So that, so you definitely can do that within product mapping. What I'm hearing though is a little bit of, can we just adjust the actual demand by a certain percentage or not? Which that one you can't necessarily directly adjust. Say take 50% of your own historic demand, but that said, there is the ability to, across the, use things like weights to adjust for those different number of, case sizes or whatever, or you can also use 2 different units of conversion in there as well, or so that you have one case size for one, another case size for another, and then you're using kind of the common complete count or something like that. So a little bit of mixed bag there. So yes, from the product mapping, you can take a percent allocation of what you're mapping from, but you can't necessarily take a percent allocation if you're mapping to within product mapping. But there are other tools for doing that within Forecast Pro.
Okay, so we're at the hour. So once again, a lot of other great questions. So we'll be in touch shortly with answers to all of them. So I guess on behalf of all of us, thanks so much for attending. We had a huge turnout for version 7, which is super awesome. Once again, if you're interested in taking a closer look with your own data, if you want a trial of the software or all of the above, please do reach out to us anytime. I'm eager and happy to talk to you about the latest version when you're ready. So thank you so much, and have a great afternoon or night.